potential. Hope you can all hear me. Any questions throughout it, do just type it into the Q&A box. And well done for starting early. If you did start early, then you should have gone and done the Socrative quiz. The student login, the room name is A Biology Tutor. It loads the quiz automatically, and there's another quiz that we're going to do at the end. Now, I've changed the format of this slightly, so we're going to be doing quite a bit of theory and then followed by looking at a few common exam questions. So hopefully that should aid your understanding a bit more. Next week is on hemoglobin dissociation curves, the Bohr shift, and transport of carbon dioxide by the blood. You can register at the website. And if you found it useful, then please recommend it to your friends so we can get, well, more people can join in and hopefully learn something. So let's make a start. So osmosis is the tendency of water molecules to move out of a solution. And they're moving across the permeable membrane to a more concentrated solution. So here we've got the water molecules. These water molecules cluster around the solute molecules, which reduces the tendency of the water to move across the membrane. So that there are more molecules here, more solute molecules here. And these solute molecules have more water molecules clustered around them because the water, remember, is polar. So it's got an uneven distribution of charge. So it's clustering around the solute molecules, which are dissolved in the water, which is the solvent, which gives us a solution. And the net movement of water will be from left to right, from an area of higher, that is less negative water potential, to an area of lower, more negative water potential. And the water will move across the membrane until the water potentials are equal. So that's the basics. Water potential is the tendency of osmosis to move out of a solution by osmosis across a partially permeable membrane. Now, the partially permeable membrane we have to consider is the phospholipid bilayer. Water molecules can leak across the phospholipid bilayer, and also they travel through aquaporins, which are proteins embedded in the phospholipid bilayer through which water can travel. So movement of water from an area of high water potential or less negative to an area of more negative or lower water potential down a water potential gradient. Pure water has a water potential of 0, and it's measured as pressure, so the unit of pressure is the kilopascals. The more you add solutes to water, the more you're going to lower the water potential, i.e. make it more negative. Water potential gets the Greek letter psi, which is this, and it's measured in kilopascals. If we start off with pure water, it's got a water potential of 0. The more solutes we add, the more negative it gets, the lower the water potential is. Students sometimes get confused between things that are high or low. Remember, everything is relative to 0 here, so the more solutes you add, the lower the water potential, because the more negative the pressure, the greater the ability of the solution to draw water into it. So minus 10 kilopascals has a higher water potential, or less negative water potential than minus 20. Minus 57 is a lower water potential than minus 13. Again, I like the terms less negative and more negative because students tend to get a little bit confused when referring to negative numbers. So here we've got two cells. One cell here has a water potential of minus 1500, and this one here minus 800, so the water will move down its water potential gradient across the cell membrane into a more negative water potential. Which way will it go here? Well, we've got 0 outside, we've got minus 500 inside, so the water will move in. Whereas in this case, we've got minus 300 and the water will move out. Classic exam question. 3 cells. Which way is the water going to move? Well, we've got a cell in the middle, which has got the highest water potential of minus 198. So the water is going to move into cell A and into cell C as well. Explain your answer. Well, cell B has a higher water potential or a less negative water potential, so water will move down the water potential gradient from B into A and from B into C. Looking at this, which way will the water go? Well, the water will go this way and this way and this way, because you're going from minus 800 to minus 950 and so on. Students get sometimes a little confused by solvents or solutes. Now, water is the solvent, and it is what we dissolve the solutes into it. Now, when you take a solute and you divide it, you dissolve it in a solvent, we get a solution. So, for instance, when we took sucrose and we dissolve it in distilled water, we'd get a solution of sucrose in the water. And the same if we put in a salt. We've got a concept of hypo, iso, and hypertonic. So these are all relative to the cytoplasm of the cell. So a hypertonic solution will have a lower water potential because it contains more solutes than the cell cytoplasm. An isotonic solution will have the same water potential. Iso means the same as in isobar. It contains the same concentration of solutes as the cell cytoplasm, whereas a hypotonic solution has a higher or less negative water potential, so it would contain less solutes. Always use these as a comparative statement because something is either hyper or hypotonic to the cell cytoplasm. So here we've got some solutions. So we've got an artificial cell with a 0.2 molar sucrose solution, and the water will move in. We've got an artificial cell with a 0.2 molar solution and 0.8 molar outside, so water will move out. And then we've got a solution where the solution is the same as the water potential, as the sucrose solution inside. So at that point, this is an isotonic solution. Now, there won't be no movement in this case. There'll be no net movement. Some water will move out, some water will move in, but there'll be no net movement. So this is a hypotonic solution because water will move in. This is a hypertonic solution, water will move out. And this is an isotonic solution. Now, if we take a red blood cell, the red blood cell, we put it into a solution where it has a less negative water potential, then water will move in. Remember, water moves until the water potentials are the same. The phospholipid bilayer doesn't have any tensile strength. So when water moves in, the volume of the cytoplasm will increase and the cell will burst. The other situation over here, the cell has been placed into a solution with a more negative water potential, so water will leave, so the volume of the cytoplasm will reduce and the cell will become crenated because the volume of the cytoplasm has reduced. So we've got a hypotonic solution with the water moving in, we've got an isotonic solution where there's no net movement of water, and we've got a hypertonic solution. Now, animal cells will show lysis, that is the bursting of the cell membrane, or they will become crenated, where the cell membrane comes away, the cell membrane wrinkles because the volume of the cytoplasm has shrunk. So important phrases to use with this are that the water potential moves down the water potential gradient to an area of more negative water potential across a membrane, the phospholipid bilayer in most cases. Other important phrases: the water continues to move until the water potentials are equal. And when the water potentials are equal, there'll be no net movement, not no movement of water, no net movement of water. Now, plant cells are slightly different because plant cells have got a utterly permeable, rigid box around the outside with tensile strength. So with plant cells, we have something called a pressure potential. Now, when you have an animal cell, you'd have water coming in. Actually, I'll do this on a whiteboard. So if we had an animal cell, then water is going to move in if we put it into a solution where the water potential outside is higher. So if we put into a solution of, say, -100, and the water potential inside is -400, then the volume of the animal cell will increase and the animal cell will burst, which is lysis, or if it's a red blood cell, then it's referred to as being hemolysis because it's a red blood cell. Now, with a plant cell, remember you've got the worst named thing in biology, which is the cell wall, because it's not a wall. Wall would imply being impermeable, whereas the cell wall is completely permeable. Now, remember the cell wall is a completely permeable cellulose box. Now, what's going to happen now is that as water moves in, the volume of the cytoplasm will swell. But unlike with the animal cell, when the cytoplasm swells, it will push against the cell wall. And the cell wall, because it's made of beta glucose in long straight chains forming hydrogen bonds between the long straight chains, that cell wall won't expand. So it's got a tensile strength, which enables it to push back onto the cell cytoplasm. And the force it's going to push back with is known as the psi-p. And this is a positive hydrostatic pressure pushing back on the cell contents. So when we have a psi-s, the solute potential, the psi-s due to the dissolved solutes within the cytoplasm of the plant cell would be -400. If we put it into a solution of -100, then water is going to move in, cytoplasm is going to swell, push against the sides, and the sides are going to push back. And it's going to push back with a pressure of +300, which would give us an overall water potential of -100. So at that point, the water potentials of the two cells are equal. So there is therefore then no further movement of water into the cell. Okay, let's keep going. So we've got pressure potential, which is the pressure applied by the cell wall back onto the contents. So the concentration of dissolved solutes in the cell vacuole and in the cell cytoplasm is the solute potential. This lowers the water potential, i.e. it's the negative component. The solute potential is always negative, and pressure potential is always positive. So when water enters the cytoplasm and the vacuole of the plant cell osmosis, the cytoplasm swells, puts pressure against the cell wall pushes back onto the cell contents, and it gives you a positive pressure potential known as psi-p. And the water potential of a plant cell is the two things added together. So you've got the water potential due to the solutes, the water coming in, and then you've got the pressure potential of the cell wall pushing back onto the contents. So here's some plant cells. We're putting this plant cell into a hypotonic solution, so water is moving in. This one's in an isotonic solution, so there's no net movement. And this one is in a hypertonic solution, so the water has moved out. Now, in the hypotonic solution, the water potential of the cell is going to have a large component of psi-p, because psi-p is pushing back onto the cell contents. So the overall water potential, if the water potential, if the water potential of the distilled water was 0, the pressure of psi P is going to equal psi S. Now, the plant cell, when it's in an isotonic solution, will show incipient plasmolysis, which is where 50% of the plant cells in a field of view are plasmolysed and 50% are not. Now, this is quite a difficult concept for many people to get their heads around. And the point here is that plant cells will vary. So the water potential of the cytoplasms of the plant cells will be different. They will differ by a small amount. So when you put them under a microscope and you look down and half the cells are plasmolysed, that is, the cell wall, cell membrane is coming away from the cell wall, and half the cells are plasmolysed and half the cells are not, then at that point, the water potential of the solution that you're putting the cells into is the same as the average plant cell, because half of them are plasmolysed and half of them are not. So at that point, it's in an isotonic solution. So 50% of the plant cells are plasmolysed and 50% of them will be turgid. Now, in a hypertonic solution, the water leaves, so the volume of the cytoplasm reduces. And at that point, there's no pressure from the cell wall back onto the cell contents. The cell is flaccid and psi P is 0. Okay, we had a couple of little questions. Hypotonic, so somebody said, so hypotonic means a lower solute concentration inside the cell. No, it's relative to the external solution. So the solution is hypotonic to the inside of the cell. So if something was placed in a hypotonic solution, it means you've got a higher solute concentration inside the cell, so a more negative water potential inside the cell, so water will move in from the hypotonic solution into the cell. Okay, so we've put it into pure water. Water's going to move in and you'll get a psi P. An animal cell will burst. If it's a red blood cell, it will be hemolyzed. But within a plant cell, the pressure potential psi P placed back onto the contents will prevent the plant cell from bursting. Now, if we put something in a hypertonic solution, so we put it into a very negative water potential solution, then water is going to move out, and that will cause the cell to become plasmolysed. Now, with an animal cell, it's said to be crenated because you've got no cell wall around the outside. So here's a few questions. So this is a classic question. So we give you 3 cells and they give you the water potential formulae. They say the pressure potential is 900 kilopascals and the solute potential is minus 1600. Calculate the water potential of cell G, and you just have to add the 2 together and you get minus 700 kilopascals. So this will be minus 700 kilopascals will be the water potential of the cell. Another question there? Oh, no, I've answered that one. That's good. All right. So another classic question here. Investigation was carried out into which red blood cells were placed in a salt solution of different concentrations. Percentage of the cells destroyed by bursting. So we did lots of experiments here. So the independent variable is salt concentration. The dependent variable is the percentage of cells destroyed by hemolysis. Now, when you put it into distilled water, they all burst. And as you increase the salt concentration, when you get to about 3.25, then they don't burst quite so much. And as you increase the salt solution, they burst less than less until you get to about 4.75, where none of them burst. So they burst over a range of external solutions. Now, explain in terms of water potential why red blood cells burst when placed in a solution that has a lower concentration than plasma, and that's because the water moves in, down its water potential gradient, cytoplasm swells, and the cell bursts. The next things that they go on to ask is, how could you work out the water potential of the red blood cells? And that would be the point at which half of them burst and half of them do not. So if you then read off the 50% point, then you'd say it was about 4 grams per decimeter cubed. And the point of why do they burst over a range, this sort of range, why don't they just burst immediately, all burst at one point? The point is that the water potentials of the cytoplasms will vary a little bit because the red blood cells will vary. Classic one with putting different potato tissues and then reweighing it into different sucrose solutions. So we've got percentage change in mass of the potato, and then we've got sucrose concentration as the independent variable, change in mass as the dependent variable. As we increase the sucrose concentrations, you reach a point where firstly they gain less mass and then they begin to lose mass. So the reason why they lose mass is that they're being placed into a solution of more negative water potential, so water is leaving, so that they lose mass. Now the point where there's no change in mass is when it's in an isotonic solution. So here we've got 0.3 molar sucrose. It's in an isotonic solution, so at that point there is no net movement. Now, if there's no net movement and it's in an isotonic solution, then psi p will be 0. So the water potential of the cell, of the sucrose cell, so psi cell, will equal 0 plus psi s. So when it neither gains nor loses mass, you know that there's no pressure applied back onto the cell contents by the cell wall. So at that point, the water potential of the cell cytoplasm is equal to the water potential of the external solution. Very common question. Okay. We had a couple of people. Which exam board requires knowledge of pressure potentials? I'm not sure. Quite a few of them do. Certainly WJC or Eduqas. I think Edexcel do as well. I think OCR does as well. Okay, next question. So a student carried out an investigation on solid potential of plant tissue. The tissue was placed in a sucrose solution, had a water potential of -600. So we know that the water potential outside is -600 and left for an hour. The diagram shows one cell after that time. Approximately 50% of the cell shows signs of plasmolysis, the other 50% did not, so that we know that this is incipient plasmolysis. Label structure J, where it's the membrane. The student concluded that the solute potential of cell was -600. Explain why you think the student reached that conclusion, and the whole point here is at incipient plasmolysis, psi p will equal 0 because half the cells are plasmolysed and half the cells are not. So psi s of the cytoplasm will equal psi s of the solute potential of the external solution. Explain the role of structure K on generating pressure potential in the cell. Well, structure K is the cell wall. So the role of K is that it has a tensile strength, so it pushes back onto the cell cytoplasm. Okay, this is a particularly unpleasant question. So make sure you have a look at this and see exactly what they've done with point 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because when this came up, it caused quite a lot of panic amongst students who didn't understand the question. So anonymous viewer said, can the membrane also be called the tonoplast? The tonoplast is the membrane that is around the outside of the vacuole. So it's not the membrane that's around the outside of the cell. That's the cell membrane. Okay, so this is a particularly unpleasant question looking at the water potential of beetroot cells. They made sucrose solutions of a known concentration. They then put beetroot discs in that solution. And they varied the concentration of the solution. And they repeated the experiment 7 times to give you an independent variable of 7 values, going from 0.1 molar sucrose to 0.7 molar. So they've put the beetroot discs in there, they've left it for 2 hours, and then they take out a small sample of liquid from the solution, and then they put it back into the original solution. And then they see whether the droplet rises or falls, and why. So a pretty difficult question, because you have to understand why the droplet would rise or fall. So you're putting the droplet of water back into the original solution. So if it falls, it's going to be more dense than the original solution. If it rises, it's going to be less dense than the original solution. Now, when they put it into 0.1 molar sucrose, then water has diffused from the sucrose solution that the beetroot cells are immersed in into the beetroot discs, which has meant that the sucrose solution has become more dense because it's lost water, which is why it sinks. When you put it into 0.2 molar, it sinks at a lower rate. 0.3 molar, it sinks at the slowest rate. Now, when you put it into 0.7 molar sucrose, so if you take a disc and it was in 0.7 molar sucrose, well, at that point, the water has moved out, making the solution, the surrounding solution, more dilute because it got more water in it, because the water's come out of the beetroot cells, because the 0.7 molar sucrose is a hypertonic solution. Now, as the water has left and gone into the sucrose solution, it's meant that the sucrose solution is more dilute, therefore it's less dense, therefore it rises, which is why the 0.7 molar solution, when you put it in the 0.7 molar solution, take a droplet out, put it into the original solution, that's why it rises. So the isotonic solution will be 0.4 molar, because the when you put the droplet from the bathing solution back into the original solution, it will neither rise nor fall because the density won't have changed. So you've seen that question, so if it comes up ever in an exam, hopefully you're at an advantage. Here's another point where it comes up is in tissue fluids formation. Because remember, tissue fluid formation is a balance of hydrostatic and osmotic pressure, in that you've got hydrostatic pressure created by the pumping of the heart, which is forcing the blood, forcing the plasma out at the arterial end, and that's balanced by a osmotic pressure called an oncotic pressure, which is the net difference between the osmotic pressure of the plasma and of tissue fluid. Now, at the arterial end, the hydrostatic pressure is greater than the oncotic pressure, but by the time it gets to the venous end of the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure is fallen and the oncotic pressure is greater. So tissue fluid moves out at the arterial end and in the venous end. But this is another point of why osmosis, understanding osmosis is important. So name the type of blood vessel. Well, it's a capillary. Name the fluid found in Y. Well, Y is a lymphatic, pulsed lymphatic system, so it's lymph. And then here's the point. The movement of water out of the blood vessels into the tissue is created by the high hydrostatic pressure. The reabsorption of the water back into the blood is due to the osmotic pressure. Name a substance found in the plasma that helps to maintain that osmotic pressure, and these are plasma proteins, particularly serum albumin, which is too large to get squeezed out of the capillary, so it stays in the capillary and reduces the osmotic pressure. Makes it more negative. And this is why you see oedemas in people with protein malnutrition, because they lack the oncotic pressure to reabsorb the water from the tissue fluid. Describe osmosis in terms of water potential. So movement of water from a high water potential to low water potential through a partially permeable membrane. This is another question about osmosis that's come up a few times. So they give you an artificial cell membrane, and into it they've put sucrose, glucose, fructose, and maltose. The membrane is permeable to monosaccharides, but not permeable to disaccharides. So in this situation, the glucose is going to diffuse in, and the fructose is going to diffuse out. The maltose is not going to diffuse anywhere because it's a disaccharide, and the sucrose can't diffuse across the membrane because it's a disaccharide. So what's going to happen here is that the sucrose concentration is going to mean that this is a hypertonic solution, so that water will move out and the volume of the artificial cell will reduce, so that the cell will shrink. So all of these are answered, I think. Explain why the volume of the cell would change. The cell has a higher water potential, so water moves out, so the volume decreases, and the water moves down its water potential gradient from a high water potential to a low water potential. Right, some synoptic points. Now, let me just go back. Hang on. Doing a disaster here. Okay. Where osmosis comes up synoptically. Generation of root pressure. So the active movement of ions into the endodermal cells in roots. So that generates a root pressure because the water follows it by osmosis, because you create a hypotonic solution in the cell cytoplasm, so it starts the uptake of water. Transpiration, where you have the evaporation of water creating a negative pressure in the xylem, so that water is being sucked up by the more negative pressure. Glomerular filtration in the kidney, because you have two forces in opposition in the kidney. So remember, you've got afferent arterial glomerular capillaries and efferent arterial. So you have a hydrostatic pressure generated by the difference between the afferent and the efferent arterioles, the difference in size of the lumen. And then you've got an oncotic pressure going back the other way. So the glomerular filtration rate is, or glomerular filtration is the resultant of the hydrostatic pressure being greater than the osmotic pressure or the oncotic pressure. Now, proximal convoluted tubule, again some synopticity there, because remember, in the proximal convoluted tubule you've got glucoses and amino acids being moved by co-transport in from the lumen, and that lowers the water potential of the PCT cell, so you then get water moving in. So remember, this is where 60 to 70% of the water is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, and it's moving in by osmosis. Descending limb of the loop of Henle, the water is moving out by osmosis through aquaporins, or the thin part, the descending limb, because it's moving into a more negative water potential in the medulla, and that more negative water potential is being created by the active transport of ions out of the ascending limb. Remember, as the fluid then goes down the collecting duct, it's going to be encountering a more negative water potential generated by the movement of ions out of the ascending limb, so that the water is going to again move out by osmosis from the filtrate into the collecting duct cells, and then into the tissue fluid, and then back into the capillaries, and then out through the renal vein. And remember, the permeability of the collecting duct is affected by ADH. So osmoregulation and homeostasis, you've got osmoreceptor cells in your brain which measure the water potential of the blood plasma, and that when the blood plasma becomes too negative, i.e. you don't have enough water in it, then you increase the production of ADH from the posterior pituitary gland, which makes the collecting duct cells more permeable. Therefore, you take up more water. Therefore, you produce a more negative, more concentrated filtrate, because you've taken more water out of it. Tissue fluid, I talked about a little bit. Solute potential of the plasma due to the plasma proteins, which are too large to get squeezed across the capillaries, so you lower the water potential of the plasma, so it gives it an oncotic pressure. And finally, the wonders of contractile vacuoles, which are you find in amoebae, paramecium, all that sort of thing, where you've got a problem because they haven't got a cell wall, so they can't create a pressure potential, so they can't put pressure back onto the cell contents. So that as water moves in, when they're in a hypotonic solution, then they have a vacuole which contracts and pushes the water out again, because they don't have a cell wall. Okay, any questions, please feel free to ask them. I will load up the next quiz so that people can be having a go at that. Where are we? So I'll just give me a moment, I'll load up the quiz, and then I'll answer any questions you want. Okay, so the second quiz is running now, so please go back to the Socrative room and I'll see if I can answer some questions for you. So I've got a few questions. So anonymous viewer, first of all, asked, which exam paper is this beetroot question from and which board? It's, I think, from Eduqas from a couple of years ago. What's the countercurrent multiplier system in the kidney? Is it simply the movement of water from the collecting ducts due to the decreasing water potential as it meets the medulla? No, it's the fact that as the filtrate moves down the thin descending limb, the water leaves by osmosis because it's encountering a more negative water potential as it goes down the medulla, and then when it turns the corner and goes up the ascending limb, it's already quite concentrated because it's been passively concentrated as the water's left as it's gone down. And then when you go up the ascending limb, you actively pump out the ions, which generates the water potential gradient to concentrate it as it goes down the descending limb. And you've said, so the contractile vacuole will effectively not be affected by the solute potential outside the cell. Well, the solute potential outside the cell is causing the water to move in. that water then drains into the contractile vacuole, which contracts and then pumps it out again. So it prevents the cell from swelling up and bursting. Any more questions, people? And are you enjoying the quiz?